All right, Chapter 4. The country described, a proposal for correcting modern maps, the king's palace, and some account of the metropolis, the author's way of traveling, the chief temple described. I now intend to give the reader a short description of this country as far as I traveled in it, which was not above 2,000 miles round Gllvr, the metropolis. For the queen, whom I always attended, never went farther when she accompanied the king in his progress, and there stayed till his majesty returned from viewing his frontiers. The whole extent of this prince's dominions reaches about 6,000 miles in length, and from 3 to 5 in breadth, whence I cannot but conclude that our geographers of Europe are in a great error by supposing nothing but sea between Japan and California. For it was ever my opinion that there must be a balance of earth to counterpoise the great continent of Tartary, and therefore they ought to correct their maps and charts by joining this vast tract of land to the northwest part of America, wherein I shall be ready to lend them my assistance. The kingdom is a peninsula, terminated to the northeast by a ridge of mountains 30 miles high, which are altogether impassable by reason of the volcanoes upon the tops. Neither do the most learned know what sort of mortals inhabit beyond these mountains, or whether they be inhabited at all. On the 3 other sides it is bounded by the ocean. There is not one seaport in the whole kingdom, and those parts of the coast into which the rivers issue are so full of pointed rocks, and the sea generally so rough, that there's no venturing with the smallest of their boats, so that these people are wholly excluded from any commerce with the rest of the world. But the large rivers are full of vessels, and abound with excellent fish, for they seldom get any from the sea, because the sea fish are the same size as those in Europe, and consequently not worth catching, whereby it is manifest that nature, in the production of plants and animals of so extraordinary a bulk, is wholly confined to this continent, of which I leave the reasons to be determined by philosophers. However, now and then they take a whale that happens to be dashed against the rocks, which the common people feed on heartily. These whales I have known so large that a man could hardly carry one upon his shoulders, and sometimes, for curiosity, they are brought in hampers to Gllvr. I saw one of them in a dish at the king's table, which passed for a rarity, but I did not observe he was fond of it, for I think, indeed, the bigness disgusted him, although I have seen one somewhat larger in Greenland. The country is well inhabited, for it contains 51 cities, near 100 walled towns, and a great number of villages. To satisfy my curious reader, it may be sufficient to describe Gllvr. This city stands upon almost 2 equal parts on each side of the river that passes through. It contains above 80,000 houses and about 600,000 inhabitants. It is in length 3 glomglugs, which makes it about 54 English miles, and 2.5 in breadth, as I measure it myself in the royal map made by the king's order, which was laid on the ground on purpose for me, and extended 100 feet. I paced the diameter and circumference several times barefoot, and, computing by scale, measured it pretty exactly. The king's palace is no regular edifice, but a heap of buildings about 7 miles round. The chief rooms are generally 240 feet high, and broad and long in proportion. A coach was allowed to Glumdalglitch and me, wherein her governess frequently took her out to see the town, or go among the shops, and I was always of the party, carried in my box, although the girl, at my own desire, would often take me out and hold me in her hand, that I might more conveniently view the houses and the people as we passed along the streets. I reckoned our coach to be about a square of Westminster Hall, but not altogether so high. However, I cannot be very exact. One day the governess ordered our coachman to stop at several shops, where the beggars, watching their opportunity, crowded to the sides of the coach, and gave me the most horrible spectacle that ever a European eye beheld. There was a woman with a cancer in her breast, swelled to a monstrous size, full of holes, and in 2 or 3 of which I could have easily crept, and covered my whole body. There was a fellow with a wen in his neck, larger than 5 wool packs, and another with a couple of wooden legs, each about 20 feet high. But the most hateful sight of all was the lice crawling on their clothes. I could see distinctly the limbs of the vermin with my naked eye, much better than those of a European louse through a microscope, and their snouts with which they rooted like swine. They were the first I had ever beheld, and I should have been curious enough to dissect one if I had had proper instruments, which I unluckily left behind me in the ship, although, indeed, the sight was so nauseous that it perfectly turned my stomach. Besides the large box in which I was usually carried, the Queen ordered a smaller one to be made for me, about 12 feet square and 10 high, for the convenience of traveling, because the other was somewhat too large for Glumdalclitch's lap, and cumbersome in the coach. It was made by the same artist whom I directed in the whole contrivance. This traveling closet was an exact square, with a window in the middle of 3 of the squares, and each window was latticed with iron wire on the outside to prevent accidents in long journeys. On the fourth side, which had no window, 2 strong staples were fixed, through which the person that carried me, when I had a mind to be on horseback, put a leathern belt and buckled it about his waist. This was always the office of some grave, trusty servant in whom I could confide, whether I attended the king and queen in their progresses, or were disposed to see the gardens, or pay a visit to some great lady or minister of state in the court, when Glumdalclitch happened to be out of order. For I soon began to be known and esteemed among the greatest officers, I suppose more on account of their majesty's favour than any merit of my own. In journey, when I was weary of the coach, a servant on horseback would buckle on my box and place it upon a cushion before him, and there I had the full prospect of the country on 3 sides from my 3 windows. I had in this closet a field bed, a hammock hung from the ceiling, 2 chairs, and a table neatly screwed to the floor to prevent being tossed about by the agitation of the horse or the coach. And having long used to sea voyages, these motions, although sometimes very violent, did not discompose me. Whenever I had a mind to see the town, it was always in my travelling closet, which Glumdalclitch held in her lap in a kind of open sedan, after the fashion of the country, borne by 4 men, and attended by 2 others in the Queen's livery. The people, who had often heard of me, were very curious to crowd about the sedan, and the girl was complacent enough to make the bearers stop, and to take me in her hand, that I might be more conveniently seen. I was very desirous to see the chief temple, and particularly the tower belonging to it, which is reckoned the highest in the kingdom. Accordingly, one day my nurse carried me thither, but I may truly say I came back disappointed, for the height is not above 3,000 feet, reckoned from the ground to the highest pinnacle top, which, allowing for the difference between the size of those people and us in Europe, is no great matter for admiration, nor at all equal in proportion, if I rightly remember, to Salisbury steeple. But, not to detract from a nation, to which during my life I shall acknowledge myself extremely obligated, it must be allowed that whatever this famous tower wants in height is amply made up in beauty and strength, for the walls are near 100 feet thick, built of hewn stone, whereof each is about 40 feet square, and adorned on all sides with statues of gods and emperors, cut in marble, larger than life, placed in their several niches. I measured a little finger which had fallen down from one of these statues, and lay unperceived among some rubbish, and found it exactly 4 feet and an inch in length. Glumdalclitch wrapped it up in her handkerchief, and carried it home in her pocket, to keep among other trinkets, of which the girl was very fond, as children her age usually are. The king's kitchen is indeed a noble building, vaulted at top, and about 600 feet high. The great oven is not so wide, by 10 paces, as a cupola at St. Paul's, for I measured the latter on purpose after my return. But if I should describe the kitchen grate, the prodigious pots and kettles, the joints of meat turning on the spits, with many other particulars, perhaps I should be hardly believed. At least a severe critic would be apt to think I enlarged a little, as travellers are often suspected to do. To avoid which censure, I fear I've run too much into the other extreme, and that if this treatise should happen to be translated into the language of the Brobdingnag, which is the general name of that kingdom, and transmitted thither, the king and his people would have reason to complain that I have done them an injury by a false and diminutive representation. His Majesty seldom keeps above 600 horses in his stables. They are generally from 54 to 60 feet high, but when he goes abroad on solemn days, he is attended for state by a military guard of 500 horses, which, indeed, I thought was the most splendid sight that could ever be beheld, till I saw part of his army in Batilia, whereof I shall find another occasion to speak.